Good morning, everybody. Yes, I am standing up. Somebody was going to yell it sooner or later. I just thought I'd stop it now. I'm Carol Reardon, and on behalf of the Gettysburg Foundation and the National Park Service, we welcome you for the continuation of our Sacred Trust program. We are delighted to see so many of you here for the first event of the morning. It was foggy this morning, wasn't it? And we weren't quite sure after a full day yesterday who the truly brave and bold would be to be here, but you have demonstrated your commitment, and we thank you for your presence. We are pleased to collaborate with the National Park to invite all kinds of renowned speakers to our series. We have Civil War historians, we have authors, we have National Park Service rangers, we have licensed battlefield guides. We got everybody here. All the cool kids are here today. And we are glad that you are joining this to be part of the Sacred Trust and listen to their unique perspectives on the battle and on the Civil War. Our first presenter this morning is somebody who I have known for over 30 plus years. We realized that, we kind of cringed, but we're soldiering on anyway. This is Dr. Brian Steele Wills. His talk is entitled Promise Tempered, William Dorsey Pender at Gettysburg, somebody we always talk about, but we don't really know that much about. So I'm looking forward to this with a great deal of anticipation. I first met Brian when he was a graduate student at the University of Georgia, and I was on my very first teaching gig. That was a very long time ago, and in talking this morning, we were kind of going back and forth on the kinds of stories we could tell on each other, because Lord knows we love these opportunities to tell stories about what we were like when we were extremely much younger. We discovered to our dismay that our memories are not that good and we don't have any. So he gets away easy, and apparently so do I. But what he's going to talk to us about today, or who he's going to talk to us today about, is Dorsey Pender. On July 2nd, 1863, shrapnel from a burst of a Union artillery shell slashed through the thigh of the Confederate general. He was probing the lines, looking to see where, in fact, his division might do the most good as part of the second day's action. Although young and ambitious, North Carolinian had overcome wounds in earlier actions, this wound proved debilitating and ultimately will lead to his death. There are all kinds of questions that continue about his potential and just how important his loss would be to the Confederacy, not just at Gettysburg, but in the future. Brian is the author of a number of works relating to the American Civil War. He has done very well for himself, and I want to get his title correct now. Professor of History and Director of the Center for the Study of the Civil War Era at Kennesaw State University in Georgia. He has written this wonderful book about General Pender, but some of you might well know him for his other work on General Nathan Bedford Forrest. He's also written a biography of Charlton Heston. I don't know how that fits into anything else. But all of us have that little itch we have to scratch somehow, and that just happens to be Brian's. When it gets to question and answer, you might want to nail him down on that one. But it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today our first speaker for today's series, Dr. Brian Steele Wills.
I will step up. That'll be the first challenge. It's always the first challenge, just to be able to get up to the podium. I did have a similar thing with Carol in this sense that God, when I was in line, I said, I want to be tall, and he said, that's all. So, so I'm not amongst the tallest human beings that'll ever be. They will not confuse me with Abraham Lincoln, even without my stovepipe hat. So as Ed Bars would say. So I'm delighted to be here. I came to speak here a number of years ago, and I have my beautiful umbrella that was one of the gifts at that time. And it's, of course, where I can use it best. It's in the car. So senior moments hit all of us at different times, and mine seem to be coming with great gusto as time goes forward. My father used to say, though, it's better to be seen than viewed, and I can certainly understand that. I'm glad that I'm not laid out. And I really do. I've already told my wife Elizabeth's here, and I said, Elizabeth, when it's that time, no open coffin. I don't want everybody looking at me saying, oh, doesn't he look good? No, don't you hate it when they say, doesn't he look good? And you're dead. Of course you look good because you're very peaceful. If the person doesn't hate you, they put a smile on your face. When you think about the power somebody like that has, they could make you look any way you want and you'll never be able to change it again. So there you go. So be good to the Undertaker because the Undertaker is going to have the last laugh. Do I need to do something? Oh, I got to get my PowerPoint. Can you? That's all right, Wayne.
Get it for you because I forgot to do that.
Well, that's all right. Wayne's going to fix us up. And I really do appreciate Wayne and his invitation. I appreciate that. I've got so many friends I see out in the audience that I know I've done things with through the time, and it's always good to be with all of you. And I will tell you this real quick while we're getting this up. When I came to Kennesaw, it was in 2010, and I had been teaching in Southwest Virginia for about 17 years, I guess it was, and that's where I met my wife, and we got married. And when I first got to Kennesaw, I came to the door that was one of the two office doors for my center. We don't have a big center with museum. I don't have to deal with things like Wayne does and everybody else does, where it's the enormous things to worry about. But I have a few display cases and a lot of books, and we were very pleased about coming to Kennesaw and then having that space. And when I got there was a big wreath on the door. And it made me a little bit nervous because it said, "Rest in peace." And I said, well, I've just arrived. This is not a good sign. This does not bode well for the future. And so I called the head of my advisory board, volunteers of folks who in the community and are connected with Kennesaw who have helped out over the years. And he says, well, I'll get in touch with the florist and find out what happened, and I'll get back to you. And the florist called very apologetically, and he says, it's just a terrible mistake. But he says, if you feel bad, imagine that at some sacred spot in some quiet location, it's another wreath that says, good luck in your new location. So it could have been worse. Could have been worse. So anyway, I put this as promise tempered because, as I'm sure you'll ask questions after the fact, what might have been but never was or never would be because of the way circumstances unfolded. Now, I will just tell you, and I've done a lot of touring through the years with a lot of people, including Ed Bars and others, and they know, the 35th North Carolina stood here and then moved over here. Rick Eierman's that kind of person. He knows those Texans left and right. They stood here for 2 seconds, and 3 drops of sweat came off, and then they moved over here. Well, 4. I'm sorry, it was 4. Okay, so I'm just not that kind of historian. I'm more of a general historian. I want to try to understand the milieu. Isn't that a nice way to say that? But the mindset, what is it that made these people tick? And I love biography. And when we get into the Heston question, I called it Running the Race, the Public Face of Charlton Heston, in part because I love the movies and I love history, and then Heston was connected with so many epics. And I wrote a book about the Civil War in the movies that I'm really very proud of and love a lot, done a lot of talks through the years. But these are all my Pender connections, including my book on William Dorsey Pender. And then I became familiar with him from a book I wrote about my hometown, my home region, called Suffolk, Virginia. And if you've ever been, how many have ever been to Suffolk? We've got a hand. Look at this. I'm proud of you. I won't ask what you thought of it because the Yankees took most of the earthworks down. So it's not like you can walk in and see all of this that's left behind. And modern times have taken some of the rest of it around. There are some jewels in there. But the book in the middle, The War Hits Home, I gave my parents, this is going to be bizarre, I gave my parents a copy of that on September 11th. Yes, that September 11th. Isn't that bizarre? And so the war hit home in a lot of ways. In that case, the war on terrorism hit home. I never forget, I was teaching, and we got out of class because somebody said there'd been a plane flew into the World Trade Center, and I thought it was just a commercial plane that had a bad accident. And we found out, of course, it was much different than that. But the Pender story is very much in that. I'll touch on that a little bit, but that's where I got introduced to him. And then I had read the letters of Pender and to his wife Fanny, and they did a sort of revised version of that, and I wrote the introduction. So that's how I came to be familiar with William Dorsey Pender. And I found him to be absolutely fascinating. So we're going to spend a little time getting to know him a little bit better. He was a West Pointer. He will spend again, he's only 29 when he's mortally wounded from his encounter here at Gettysburg on day 2. But he lived a lot in the short life he had. My dad was funny. He says, "Son, you've lived a lot in the time you've been here compared to me." And my dad was a farmer, and he did a lot of things. Again, I told him I wouldn't have his job for all the money in Texas. You can't control anything, the weather and what nature does and everything else. My wife's a juvenile and domestic relations judge, and I told her the same thing. I wouldn't have her job because think about all the things you have to put up with. And the only thing I have to deal with is the occasional dean and different other things at one time or another, a student that might be an excitement or whatever. But most of the time it's pretty light. But at West Point, one of the people that Pender was very close to was Samuel Turner Shepard, and he had a younger sister, Mary Frances. And during, I said, a fateful visit, during a visit at the Shepard home, he met her, and he fell pretty much, I would actually say probably definitely in love at first sight. I mean, if it wasn't love at first sight, it couldn't have taken more than 2 sights. It was pretty quick. The comment was made that I'd written about Forrest. Forrest fell in love with his wife the same way, just right off the spot. And the guardian for the young woman that Forrest fell in love with said, "You cuss and gamble, and Marianne's a Christian girl," because they knew that that was not the characteristic one would say for Forrest, that he was a Christian man, although at the end of his life he did come to salvation. So when we all go to that great campground in the sky, he's going to be there whether we like it or not. At any rate, Samuel Turner was apparently just a very dynamic, interesting young man. He went out to Fort Leavenworth where he got sick and ultimately died, and that death also brought these two very close together. So a lot of what brought Pender and his future wife together was not only that connection to a West Point colleague, but the terrible and very short life, tragic life of her brother. And you can see that Pender was in the class of 54, 19th out of 46. So he wasn't first, but he wasn't George Custer either. So he wasn't dead last either, or someone else. And that's a picture of Mary Frances and William Dorsey. All right. This is the comment that's made about Sam Shepard. It gives you a small idea of, again, how much he packed into a life. And Pender, I'm not saying that he modeled himself after Sam Shepard, but I think he did feel a real affinity for him. And in a lot of ways, I think he saw that this was the kind of person that if you're going to pick anyone you might want to be like, he would be that. But he's very young, 24 years old, just a little bit over that, when he dies at Fort Leavenworth. And that's the comment or the carving that's on that marble that you see there. So here's Pender at the time of the war. Again, a very dynamic-looking, young-looking officer. And he will write to his wife Fanny quite a lot, even in the pre-war years, once they get married. And he will spend a lot of his time making comments about his pre-war activities, which were mostly, once he got into action, would have been in the Pacific Northwest. So he sees some fighting in that region that actually is his initial exposure to combat. So he's not old enough to be in some of the things that we know that Civil War generals tended to cut their teeth in Mexico and other places. Pender kind of cuts his teeth in a relatively small action, but one of the things that he does is he starts getting into the habit of reporting on his activities and reporting on his conditions and asking Fanny about her. And one of the comments that he'll make once it's clear that the circumstances have arisen for hostilities to develop is that he's going to resign his commission. And you can see that in March 1861, he will make it clear that he's not going to look back. Now, interestingly enough, he comes into this situation before his state does. You know, some of these individuals are going to wait out to see what their state will do, and that was actually true of Forrest. He actually had plantation land in Mississippi, but he really didn't get involved until Tennessee made up its mind. So that first big wave of Deep South secession that followed Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, and then starting, of course, with South Carolina and then leading on with those other Deep South states, it's the border South states that really come into effect after Fort Sumter gets fired on, and then Lincoln calls for volunteers. Either quotas are going to have to be supplied, or states like the Commonwealth of Virginia are going to have to make decisions. And North Carolina is one of that second phase of secession that occurs. So Pender fairly quickly, because he does have some background, he has some training, gets tasked with one of those things that's probably fairly common for an awful lot of people, and that's trying to train other people how to be soldiers. If so many of these individuals are volunteers and you want them to be soldiers that you can count on a future battlefield, they need to learn the ropes. They need to learn how things go. Pender never lost that. There's some people that argue that when Scales is put forward later on, as we get close to Gettysburg and then the fighting around Gettysburg, that Pender takes the pains of being available or nearby, and actually, as one person puts it, sort of does on-the-job training for Scales. And so, again, that drill instructor, that mentality is always with Pender. And Pender demanded excellence of himself. He will demand excellence of everyone around him. Now, that's just in his DNA. That's just his way of doing things. He's also very proud of himself. We'll talk a little bit about that. Here's a little of the connection. Pender goes back, of course, to Tarboro. If you follow his life and legacy, if you look at the way he's, his background is definitely North Carolina. One of the great comments, of course, is that North Carolina is the valley of humility between two peaks of conceit, Virginia and not South Carolina, but Charleston. And so you can draw whatever you want. I'm a native Virginian, so if somebody's insulted, I would be insulted myself. But I grew up not too far. My county that I grew up in was Nansemond County, that doesn't exist anymore. I don't know what that says. But it doesn't exist. It's now Suffolk. It got melded in with Suffolk. Suffolk, area-wise, is the third largest county, largest city in the world. It's pretty amazing, but it still has farms and cows, at least the last time I went to visit. And so one of the things that Pender will do is spend a lot of his time in Raleigh and then going on up into a little bit closer to the Virginia border at Weldon, and then ultimately up into Suffolk itself in these earliest days, where a lot of what he's doing is training and preparing people for war. One of the comments I think is very fascinating because it fits Pender in this earliest phase connected with the 6th North Carolina. You see their motto, deeds, not words. And Pender liked words. He is very, unfortunately, sometimes a little too quick to tell what he thinks and how he feels. Some people might actually be able to, if they ever got their hands on it, use some of that against him a little bit. Because if he had an opinion about you, good, bad, or indifferent, he would share it. He would let you know. But he believed in deeds. He very much was a man of action. He believed in doing what you're supposed to do, fulfilling your duty, fulfilling your obligations. And again, he didn't really wait on North Carolina to figure out what they're going to do before he was involved himself. He's very much a stickler, and sometimes that rubbed people the wrong way. I mean, one of the harshest things, I guess, for me to learn was in high school when I had a teacher that said, "Brian, not everybody's going to like you, and there's nothing you can do about it." And that kind of broke my heart because I thought, there's probably not anybody on earth you can't win over. if you try hard enough. And I think Pender probably had that side to him. If you have identities with the subjects you write, that makes them even closer to your heart. And I think maybe that's Pender too, because there was sometimes I think he took the way others viewed him a little close to the vest. If you've ever followed the notions or the sense of Southern honor, that your sense of self-worth is dependent on what others think of you, you can understand that if you think that was a prevalent mindset and attitude in the South prior to the Civil War and then during it, that would be certainly true, I think, of Pender too. So the notion that what others think of you matters, and that people will be watching. In a minute, we'll make a quick comment about Jefferson Davis and then a couple comments about Robert E. Lee. But Pender knew that some people at higher levels were paying attention to what he was doing, and I don't think he certainly was oblivious to that fact. But one of the things that you're going to do is you're going to expect loyalty, you expect obedience. When you're trying to tell somebody to do something, you expect them to do it. All right, from Suffolk, Virginia, this is my little community, my little hometown that I wrote the book about. It talks about, I said, early war travels and travails. He spent so much of the first part of the war in North Carolina, and then he ultimately made his way to Virginia. And I will say again, this was a young man evolving. He's learning to be a husband. He's learning to be a father. He's learning to be a soldier. He's learning to be an officer. And all of these things kind of happening in rapid fashion on a scale that he had not imagined before this war took place, just like that would be true of so many people. So little Suffolk, Virginia becomes kind of an interesting jumping off point because he's not going to quite go straight to where the main action is, but there's plenty of action here, and he gets caught up in that and ends up learning some life's lessons that I think are pretty important to him. So that's a picture from Harper's of the little community of Suffolk, Virginia. Well, I should probably say this. I don't think I put that slide in, and it doesn't matter. But one of the things he does when he gets to Suffolk, just say this very quickly, is he gets really full of himself, and he shows it early and often. He'll say at one point in one of his letters, the colonel is quite a lion, and he's talking about himself. And he's telling his wife. Now, there are times, and I'm not going to ask how many people are married and all that stuff because we don't want to get personal about it, but there's sometimes you tell your wife things, and there's sometimes you might judiciously decide to withhold that information. Not saying that I've ever held anything back from Elizabeth. She knows everything. There's nothing that I've ever done that she does not know about and approve of. Isn't that right, dear? But just on the off chance that I've forgotten, because as you get older, sometimes you forget these things, you would sometimes be wise not to say everything, and certainly not say it in the way that William Dorsey Pender did. Because Pender will be busy laying out almost daily, not quite daily, but almost daily, all of his socializing and activities. And one historian made sort of a comment that maybe there was something going on there. I can tell you right now that Pender was very loyal to his wife. There was nothing that happened that I think that he could not have lived with or explained or anything else. The problem is he just was full of himself, and he was telling her that, and his way of expressing that was to show what everybody else thought of him. And so he will make comments about being invited to dinners and Sunday lunches and all these things, and that he's got all these beautiful women that are showing attention to him, and his wife and difficult pregnancies and all kinds of things. There's a lot of issues going on in his personal life, again, that he might have been wise not to feel the need to share all this information. But one of the letters he says is that he knew that some of these women were trying to pick out the married men as if somehow they were special targets. And he says, you need not ever be ashamed of me because they know me. And I do this because, of course, I want to bring a great honor to Mrs. W.D. Pender. So even when he talks to her, he's reminding her that she is his and he is hers, and all of that sort of thing. But she had apparently, this one woman, although he doesn't name her name, and so we're not 100%, you couldn't say for sure, but the connections are all there, had offered to make him a scarf. And he said, she's offered to make me a scarf. I told her she can't make anything for me, but she can make something for my wife. And then she said that, this is, again, you almost cringe when you hear it, but this is Dorsey Pender telling honestly what he thinks. He says she has agreed she will do anything for me, but she's not going to make a scarf for you. So she will do anything for me. And of course, you can read into anything for me and what that might mean. Of course, he, I think, was the innocent little lamb that kept going forward, just assuming that her adoration was enough of him, and it was enough for him to be the object of that adoration. And he will say that it's very difficult. These creatures may not be able to rest because I am here, because of my presence here. So he's full of himself, but that's the early Pender. He will at one point tell her that before the war, he will tell her that she's not to do any of the fancy dances at the fort while he's off on his missions, on his duties, and that she should behave herself. And basically then he tells her he's been flirting and dancing. He tells all of this stuff to her. And she finally has enough and writes a letter, and the reason we have it is because he sent back a little note at the bottom of it. But in that letter, she says, read to end. If you ever get a letter that says read to end, do not read to the end unless you want your feelings hurt. And then she lays him out. She says, well, first of all, she tells him some things about the family and just generic kinds of things. Then she says, you wrote this, and she quotes him on these various and sundry things that he has said. And she says, why in your sober senses did you write this to me? Well, and of course, he didn't really have his sober senses about him. He was so full of himself, he wasn't thinking about it. And she finally, just like I said, laid him out. So at the end, to keep this in mind where we're headed, he will say, tonight this war holds no more terrors for me, because she has really crucified him. She has laid him out, and he knows it. And so he sends back this letter, and he promises that he'll do better. And he actually does. I think that's what's fascinating, is he learned that lesson, and he actually does. It's later on when there are mentions of ladies, they tend to be older ladies that are very society-oriented, or maybe in hospitals, et cetera, whatever it might be. It's certainly not the kind that one would have a flirtation dance or Sunday dinner with. So he's learned to behave himself. Now, eventually he does get into more active campaigning at Seven Pines or Fair Oaks. He will see his first action. This is a map from the book that I wrote on Dorsey Pender. I called it The Hope of Glory because he wanted earthly glory. He definitely wanted that. But one thing his wife did was she kept kind of pushing him towards heavenly glory too. And he ends up being saved and baptized in front of his regiment. So a very public kind of activity for a man that would not have been the common case for him. That would not be typically what he would do. And yet, because he is sort of changed and developing and evolving, he is doing something that ends up being a subject for tracts to be handed out to people as a model or an example of what a Christian officer would do. So Pender is very much a different kind of guy as he goes forward, in part because, again, of his experiences and his own mistakes, we'll call them that for lack of better terms. But once he gets to combat, he's also learning again how to handle troops in the field. He's also trying to figure out, what do I do to bring glory? Because he understood that you have success, you do well, and you'll get promotion. You'll get a chance to be at a different level of contribution to the war effort. A lot of my work is done in the Western Theater because of Atlanta and Kennesaw, which Kennesaw is just outside of Atlanta, not too far. I kind of think it's far enough, but not yet far enough. Atlanta keeps closing in. Even the Braves have closed in. The Braves have moved to that side of Cobb County, towards Cobb County. Anyway, lack of better terms, though, Albert Sidney Johnston was supposed to have said, the test of merit in our profession is success. It's a hard test, a hard rule, but I think a good one. And I think Pender would have certainly bought into that, agreed with that the test of merit in our profession is success. Now, I've seen people make the comment that Pender received a battlefield promotion and that he was one of a couple of individuals who did. I will say I don't know that that's true, but that in this particular instance, he came under the eyes of the President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. And Davis does make the comment, General Pender, I salute you. I do not know that he was trying to say any more than you've done a good job, and he threw out a title that just kind of maybe came to his mind. Maybe he was trying to suggest that you deserve a promotion. Again, can you say he got a battlefield promotion? Pender was certainly very proud of it, but I don't know that one can say that entirely. Okay, at Mechanicsville or Beaver Dam Creek, he sees very heavy action. Some significant casualties occur. And if you see the woodcut at the top, you can kind of see an image from the time. If you look at the photograph at the bottom, you can see that it's still very problematic, challenging terrain to fight. And Pender's part of that assault force that goes through Mechanicsville pretty easily, but then runs up against Beaver Dam Creek and finds that fighting there is going to be very vicious and very difficult. Now, Pender is lucky. He doesn't get into too many circumstances where his own life is forfeit early on, although he does seem to attract metal. He does seem to attract wounds. That won't be yet quite the case, but you'll notice that as we run through some of this fairly quickly, that he has a tendency to end up being at least exposed enough to danger to sustain a wound here and there. This was heavy fighting, but he was lucky not to have that occur here. At 2nd Manassas, he will get wounded. He'll get wounded slightly. He's involved, again, right at the heart of that fighting under Thomas Jonathan Stonewall Jackson against John Pope. And you'll notice that he is going to inform Fanny of what has happened, but he doesn't want to alarm her, so he downplays his own personal injuries and so forth. But, he says, I'm safe and sound, which is always a good thing to lead off with when your next line is going to be, I've been hit on the head with a shell. So one has to kind of be careful about saying the first part to soften the blow, if you will, of the second part. But once Pender is with Robert E. Lee in the Army of Northern Virginia, you'll notice that he's involved in a series of the engagements that have made Robert E. Lee's Army what it is, and will make it what it is. All right, at Harper's Ferry, Pender is actually on the southernmost part of the line, captures one of the hills that helps to seal the fate of Harper's Ferry in the Maryland campaign, as the Confederate Army moves into Maryland to try to see if they can force the hands of Europe and also, of course, maybe get Marylanders to rise up and support the Confederacy. So much of I'm writing right now a book on the emotions of the Civil War, and I think that's been a fascinating thing because one of my last books was on Inglorious Passage's non-combat mortality in the Civil War. And any kind of mortality produced emotions. People, of course, in grief or sadness, sometimes, despondency and so forth that comes from looking around at so many of one's colleagues and comrades that are struck down. There'll be individuals that said that a year ago we had a number of members of our mess, and now I'm the last one. They've been struck down. But I found that when I was looking at emotions, you're looking at all kinds of things because it's not just despair, but elation. It's not just hatred, but compassion. All of these things are part of the Civil War story. And of course, you know and I know plenty of examples of all of those things here at Gettysburg as well. But one of the things that happens is that Pender does at Harper's Ferry enable that capture of almost a treasure trove of supplies, and I put a list here of all of the things that were recorded that they were able to secure in that operation going into Maryland in the in the what becomes the Sharpsburg or Antietam campaign. He was not able to be in time because A.P. Hill was not able to be in time to get to do much at Sharpsburg. They're kind of there at the nick of time, right at the end of a bitter, long day, the bloodiest single day of fighting in the war. But a couple days after that, at the Battle of Shepherdstown, Pender was very much involved. Again, I've written about a lot of folks, Thomas, and I love biography, so it makes sense, but Thomas and Forrest and Pender and others. But one of the reasons that I like it is you kind of get a sense of the mindsets of individuals. And one of the things that Nathan Bedford Forrest is connected to that's very difficult is the Fort Pillow situation. We can call it a massacre, call it whatever you want. Certainly people were killed that should not have been killed. And one of the things that people are trying to grab onto is Forrest's descriptions of the fighting at Fort Pillow and the use of the word slaughter. And I always like to remind my students that is not an uncommon term for a lot of people. And you notice that A.P. Hill is talking about the most terrible slaughter. And keep in mind, this is happening after the single bloodiest day of the war. At Shepherdstown now you're sort of commenting with Antietam behind you and all the other things that have happened over a couple of years. So you think about it, you know, for him to make this comment really suggests that even in this kind of relatively small operation, the casualties were staggering. And you'll notice again, if you go back and look at Civil War history, Ball's Bluff, you see some of the very same descriptions of the Potomac River with bodies floating in it after the fighting at Ball's Bluff at the very beginning of the war. And here it is, the Potomac is blue with the floating bodies of our foe. Very few live to tell the tale, but it's not because they've been massacred or wiped out. It's just because that's the nature of combat. That's the nature of fighting in the American Civil War. And Pender is very much a part of this fighting at Shepherdstown that helps to make it a Confederate success. At Fredericksburg, we always think about Fredericksburg being a battle in which the Union troops will mass up against the stone wall at Marie's Heights, and that they suffer these lopsided losses that suggest that Ambrose Burnside is not a particularly capable individual. Well, he's not great, but he did give you Roanoke Island. He isn't totally incompetent. Ask James Longstreet at Knoxville. It's not as if he's absolutely the worst general in the Civil War, as I think one of the History Channel programs once put it. But he does some, not creative things at Fredericksburg, bashing your head against a fixed position and a stone wall doesn't make the most sense. But he almost breaks through. And if you think about it, George Meade has a chance to be a hero even before Gettysburg because it's against the Confederate flank that he could punch his way through. And Pender is part of, not solely responsible by any stretch of the imagination, but part of the force that will seal the breach, to seal the gap, and keep that from being worse than it is. So if you look, the gallant Pelham is going to be on the flank selling shells into the Federals that give him a nickname as well. But Pender is part of that force that helps prevent the collapse of the Confederate flank. And if it collapsed there, then the stone wall would be outflanked and irrelevant. So again, shell, shrapnel, every kind of thing you can think about, spherical case, everything you can think at that artillery can thrust into the air against an opponent, you will see it here on that flank. And that is a marker to the fighting there and to George Meade. He was also at Chancellorsville. Interestingly enough, Pender will be maybe the last person that Stonewall Jackson gives a field order to, because at one point after Stonewall Jackson is ridden out by accident and come back in and at a different point in the line and is struck down, Pender is saying we need to sort of reposition ourselves. We need to consolidate our forces. We need to get ourselves in order. And Pender is going to get rebuked, in a sense, by Stonewall Jackson that tells him very clearly, we must hold our ground, General Pender. We must hold our ground. And then Robert E. Lee is going to somewhat bring Pender to task, because as that fighting continues to develop after the flank attack that Stonewall Jackson makes it famously at Chancellorsville and rolls up O.O. Howard's troops, as that battle continues to unfold, Lee wants to continue to find the weaknesses in the Federal positions and crack the lines as best he can. And when he thinks that Pender has been among the kinds of commanders that he expected to drive forward and yet has somehow not fulfilled his expectations, you get that quote that you see at the bottom where he says, "That's the way you young men always do. You allow these people to get away." And Pender would have been mortified by that. There's nothing in the letters about that. I can tell you that he was not going to tell Fanny that particular piece. That's one part he has learned judiciously to hold to himself. But Lee could be frustrated. One of the other things I'm going to do after I finish my emotions book, and Lee is certainly involved in that as well. It's not a Southern book, it's not a Northern book, it's a everybody book. It's about how people dealt with war, whether they're at home on the home front or in wherever they might engage in the Trans-Mississippi or the Western Theater or the East, at Gettysburg or anywhere else. So the book has a little of everything, but one of the things that happens is Robert E. Lee exposes at different points that there's some fire in the old man. And he can let it loose. He can let it out. And I think the frustration of knowing that he feels like he's got that moment and that somehow that moment has slipped away is not lost on him. And you can kind of see, again, go after them and damage them all you can. That certainly, if anybody was going to do that, William Dorsey Pender would do that. If you were going to kind of think of another title, you might think of Lee's Fighting Carolinian, because he was certainly the kind of guy that would carry out the orders of Robert E. Lee to the fullest as much as he understood them to be. But my future book might be on Robert E. Lee was never wrong. And you say, well, Dr. Wills, how can you say that? He's made many mistakes, including here. I didn't say he didn't make mistakes. I didn't say he didn't mess up. But he had a reason for doing everything he did. And sometimes the situation did not give him the fullest amount of information, or there were a number of other miscalculations, but he thought he was doing what made the most sense. I always tell my students, try to understand, if you can, S-E-N-S-E, sense. And unfortunately in War II, as I say in my chapter on greed, C-E-N-T-S too. Sometimes sense dictates things as well. So Dorsey Pender's going to have a future that he knows, again, that Robert E. Lee has been a little disappointed with him. He knows that Lee is dependent on him, or at least he's one of the many people that he feels that General Lee has looked to accomplish the task that he wants. And keep that in mind when we get to Gettysburg. Of course, Stonewall Jackson will be taken out of the equation. Reshifting the commands will be necessary. A.P. Hill will be elevated, and Dorsey Pender will be elevated. Unfortunately, some of the others will have to be elevated again too, whether they've got much battle experience or not. I mentioned Alfred Scales. Scales was one of these people that's moved up very quickly and does not maybe have enough time perhaps to develop the kind of skills he might have had more time been given. When you talk about the war, and this is probably not unusual for you to think about, the other side has a vote. The other side has a vote. All right. So this is what Pender's telling Fanny. He's telling her in his letters that we're going to ultimately make a move because General Lee wants to make a move. He's not going to wait on them. Seizing the initiative was certainly something that Lee wanted to do, is what Pender wanted to do. And Pender was very effusive in his feeling about Lee and his capabilities, and he compares him to the best generals of history. And he certainly says, when you look at how he's handled these other circumstances, keep in mind, I mentioned Suffolk. My hometown, Longstreet, came there during the same period that the Chancellorsville campaign will come. It's one reason why Lee has to be creative in what he does at Chancellorsville, because he doesn't have Longstreet with him at Chancellorsville. Then you can see on June 24th, I feel that we're making an important step. there's a lot of reasons why he might be hesitant, or he might feel like, I'm a little nervous about this. And yet, at the end of the day, he was highly and supremely confident in his command and in the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia. And he felt like they were never going to be in a better position to take advantage of it. And so we get to Gettysburg, where will North Carolina point the way? And of course, North Carolina includes William Dorsey Pender. Couple of things just to lay this out. On the first day, Pender is going to be in reserve. If you talk about the fact that sometimes the units are put into position where they are the lead elements, and then others are in reserve, and then in another day it's flip-flops, so that the people that were in reserve are now the lead elements. You can almost say when Henry Heath is going to be up front, maybe Lee could have done better if he'd have had Dorsey Pender up front, but that's just the way that the circumstances evolved. That's just the way the situation occurred. Of course, you can see Alfred Scales and Abner Perrin are going to be the ones who are really given the responsibility of trying to drive the Federals after they've been confronted by Heath's Confederates and others. Of course, I won't go through all of day one that I know so many of you know so well, but one of the things that Pender is going to theoretically do is if there is success, you're going to exploit any breach or any opening. If there's not success, maybe you can do those things that will help compromise the line that has held you up so far. A lot of my students, they just look at static situations and they don't understand that these things are evolving, that these things are not clear, that when you talk about the fog of war, it's not just on the largest levels, it's very precise. I always tell them, if you are standing on a battlefield, you only know what you see in front of you or what you think you see in front of you. And the smoke of black powder really obscures even that. So if things look like they're going well, you can report that we were winning the battle. If things look like they're not, well, then you think that you're losing the battle. It might be that you're not, that other things are happening that are going to make things turn out different. One of the things that Pender will be able to benefit from is the fact that the Federals have taken a beating just like the Confederates, and the Confederates have taken a vicious beating. The July 1 fighting is very severe, and the casualties are astounding. If you've got a unit that goes in with 1,300 people, comes out with about 400, you can understand the kind of casualties, the kind of killed, wounded, missing, and captured that would be involved in that. So on day one, Pender is going to partly be responsible for finishing off what has already happened in the area in front of Seminary Ridge and then Seminary Ridge itself. Seminary Ridge ends up being a little bit of a salient that Pender's men will eventually kind of come around and be able to drive the Federals off of. The Union artillery, I was an artillerist for 5 summers at Petersburg Battlefield. It was a great summer job. I enjoyed it tremendously, getting paid by the United States government to be a Confederate artilleryman. That's a pretty good deal. But artillerists are proud, and the artillerist said, we want to keep giving the Johnnies our lead. And when you look at the blow that Scales' troops will take, the casualties there will be horrific, in part because of the Union artillery. I hate to say this, in part because of the Confederate artillery. When you're being fired at by your own troops, your own forces behind you because the powder's defective and the explosions that are supposed to go over there happen over here, shrapnel does not have names on it. It doesn't say, well, this is Confederate shrapnel and those are Confederates, we won't rain down on them. So you can imagine what the circumstances must have been like. Scales himself will be wounded. So it's a pretty severe thing. Perrin eventually does get around enough to compromise that position, and it's Perrin's South Carolinians that will be able to raise a Confederate battle flag in the streets of Gettysburg. And the streets of Gettysburg were chaotic and crazy as the troops were moving through it, both Union and Confederate. In some cases, one of the Confederates looked over and he said, I saw Union troops moving, and I said, if they see us, we're in trouble because they're actually in better shape than we are. Victorious forces are going to have unit cohesion break down just like defeated forces, casualties in their officer corps. To give you some sense, again, I like to think about those individuals. one of these Confederates is going to assault a Union artillery, part of this Union artillery that's battering them severely, makes it all the way to one of the tubes, puts his hand in front of the tube and says, I'm going to capture this gun, I'm going to take this gun, and the artillerist says, well, you damn it, you can have it, and then pulls the lanyard, and that's the end of that Confederate. He disappears in a mist because he's been literally obliterated by the blast. So it's vicious fighting. And when the Confederates finally break through, and Pender is not quite sure of just how successful they've been, at one point he comes in and he asks, where are Perrin's men? And the man he asks says, well, they're right over that ridge yonder. You'll find them. And when Pender does find them, he is elated. He's thrilled at the fact that they've been successful, and takes his hat off and waves it in salute to these troops that have broken the Federal line. But on day 2, Pender's in the center of the line, waiting to see how things will transpire on the flanks. He's particularly watching what should have been a rolling assault from the right of the Confederate line down toward the center. He's supposed to wait, as they typically do, for other units to move forward, in this case under Rhodes. And when that doesn't happen, he's kind of feeling out, trying to figure out what he can do. And he even sends some troops out to capture a small hill in front to try to set up a future attack. When he hears there's fighting, he says, we're going to investigate that and go down the line. Turns out that, unfortunately for him, in the course of that, a shell hits his leg, tears into his thigh, and knocks him out of action. There's the image from what was then the Museum of the Confederacy, and you can see the damage to the thigh. And ultimately, unfortunately, Pender is going to not survive that. Pender's last letter, he's asked for the divine protection for himself. He knows that Fanny is the one who can pray, and maybe the Lord will hear it the most, but sometimes our prayers are answered, but not in the way we want. This is actually one of his sacred books, one of his religious elements that he had on his person. That is also, again, a sense of some of the damage. You can see the damage to the scabbard there. Pender will be one of those Confederates struck down. A.P. Hill will recognize the loss. Robert E. Lee will recognize the loss. Pender will survive, at least for the moment. The wound will be healed at least enough, or closed enough to let him travel a little bit, certainly in great discomfort, but being brought back. And at Stanton, Virginia, it ends up being the wound reopens. He has trouble that requires the amputation of the limb, and he will not survive within hours of the amputation of the limb. You can see he says, my only regret is to leave my wife and our children. He does not know there's another one on the way that he will never see. And the words on his tombstone, I think, really reflect his life. Patriot by nature, soldier by training, Christian by faith. He dies on the 18th. He makes it that far, but not living long enough for Fanny to make it to see him or to be at his side. She lives for a while longer, quite a while longer, and lives quite a extensive life herself. This is Lee's assessment. 2 different times he will make the comment that basically he couldn't have asked for a more gallant officer, and that gallantry is lost now to the Army of Northern Virginia and to the Confederacy, to Robert E. Lee. And there was supposedly a comment that if Pender had stayed in the saddle for 30 more minutes, things would have been different, and maybe they would have. Fanny lives till 1922, where she passes away and is buried with her beloved husband in a beautiful cemetery there, in the church cemetery in Tarboro. Well, thank you again for having me. I really appreciate being here. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for being. Carol, thank you for your introduction and for being here as well.
How about them dogs?
How about them dogs?
We want to thank Brian for being here this morning. We want to point out that if you go over into the bookstore and go over into the visitor center itself, an awful lot of books are there ready to be signed by Brian himself. And please go over and check things out. Please, while you're over there, stop at the Friends desk, say hi to all the volunteers working back there. If you're not a member, why the heck not? Okay? Come on and sign up, join us, and help us in the good work to help the Park Service and support preservation and education things. We invite you to join Park Ranger Dan Welch here at 11 o'clock. Go take a quick break, come on back here, and the fun will continue. Thank you.